Hi, and welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. I'm Brennan Breed, and we are continuing our study of the prophets of the Exile this week. We're shifting from the book of Ezekiel to the book of Isaiah. We're going to focus on a particular part of the book of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55. So Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 are often called by biblical scholars First Isaiah, and they refer to the time of Isaiah ben Amoz, or Isaiah of Jerusalem, who was a prophet who was active sometime around the years 750 to 700 BC. He's an 8th century prophet. He lived in Jerusalem and spoke to the people of Jerusalem, particularly the king and the counselors there. And he was an incredibly effective and important prophetic figure at the time. Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 seem to be directed to a different people at a different time in a different place, and they seem to refer really to the events at the end of the exile, which is why we're studying it after Jeremiah and Ezekiel. That's why it's the end of our study of the exilic prophets, because it seems to be written maybe a year or so, or even less, before the fall of Babylon, when the Jewish people who had been taken in exile to Babylon were sent home to Jerusalem, or at least were invited to return home with gifts and money to support them rebuilding Jerusalem. So not everyone returns home at once, but it's the beginning of the process of returning home and of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So you might be tired at this point in time of all of the oracles of judgment that we've come across. Well, it's a good thing that Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 are not focusing on judgment. In fact, they focus on oracles of salvation, of God's merciful deliverance of the people, of God's grace and God's power that is directed at rebuilding and upbuilding the people. So this is a pivot point really here. The exile draws us into a conversation about structural evil, about ills and sins of all kinds that I think have a lot of analogs today in our own world. Things like structural racism, things like environmental degradation, things like taking advantage of the vulnerable people within our nation, but also internationally. A lot of those things sound pretty familiar if you read Jeremiah and Ezekiel. There's a lot of connection there. Thinking about coming out of COVID, or thinking of COVID as a time of kind of unbuilding. There is a moment, though, that emerges within the history of ancient Israel, within our own moment now, where there's a pivot from an unbuilding to a rebuilding. And at those moments, it is crucial that we listen to voices of people who are thinking of the good, thinking of God's work for good and the flourishing of all peoples, the blessing to all the peoples of the world, people who are informed by the vision of Genesis 1, that all people are made in the image of God. People are informed by the vision of Genesis 12, that the blessing of all the nations, all the families of the earth, that's the point. People who are informed by Exodus 19, that the covenant is based on this idea that the people are going to be formed as a community to mediate God's blessing like priests to all of the families of the earth. So if we're at a pivotal moment to try to hear the voices of people who are formed by that message and who are thinking about ways to build that are deeply informed by God's passion for the world, God's mission in the world. I think that's crucial, because there's a lot of people at moments of rebuilding that want to take advantage of things for themselves, to rebuild it in their own image. That's idolatry in a way, which is something that we'll hear a lot about, especially next week in our study of Isaiah. But first, let's think about this issue of multiple Isaiahs, first, second, even third Isaiah. I'll explain all that now. Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 are often called by biblical scholars First Isaiah. And what this means is it refers to the time. These are texts that in some way relate to, they don't all necessarily originate in, but they all relate to the time of Isaiah ben Amoz, ben meaning son of. Isaiah, the son of Amoz, not Amos, but Amoz. And you can see this if you turn to Isaiah chapter 1, the superscription of the beginning that says the vision of Isaiah, son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which are treated a bit differently. I'll get to that next time. But Jerusalem, so Isaiah ben Amoz was a prophet who lived in Jerusalem sometime around the years 750 to 700, probably a little bit later than that, maybe like 690 or something BC. So he's a real person who had a very long career, whereas the prophet Amos seemed to live in the northern kingdom and seemed to have, a 1 year less than 1 year career before he seems to have been killed by the state. He was executed, it seems. It's very shadowy what happened to him, but he seems to have had a very short career. On the contrary, Isaiah seems to have had a very long career. Isaiah, son of Amoz. And that's how that was the last names in the ancient world. They didn't have last names, so you'd say this person, son of this person. It would give you an idea of who that person was. So Isaiah, son of Amoz, or Isaiah of Jerusalem, the prophet who lived around the year 700 BC, lived through two major crises in ancient Jerusalem, two moments in time when Jerusalem was almost destroyed. And in both times prophesied that Jerusalem was going to survive. And so his prophecies worked. They described reality properly and encouraged faith in Yahweh. And so his words were written down and preserved and handed on. And it seems that he even says in chapter 8 of Isaiah, he says, write this stuff down and pass it up. So chapter 8 of Isaiah, verse 16, bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. So there are people who are following Isaiah, and they're disciples or people who are learning from Isaiah and really kind of in his, people call it a school sometimes. Not a school like there's no Isaiah State University, but it's a school in the sense that people are following in the tradition of Isaiah. Just like there might have been people following in the tradition of Jeremiah, like Baruch. So in any event, Isaiah seems to have had a kind of a group of followers around him, even though he did crazy things like he lived naked for several years. That's Isaiah chapter 20, if you want to hear about that. So he acted out his prophecies in strange, outlandish ways, sometimes in order to get his point across. Nonetheless, that didn't stop his disciples from being his disciples. In any event, Isaiah passes down his prophecy, and there seems to have been other people who pick it up and continue his prophetic work. So Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 relate to this time of Isaiah ben Amoz. And I say relate to, they're not all his words, because if you look at Isaiah chapters, let's say 36 and 37 and 38, 39, these come from and are borrowed from the book of Kings. Just like bits of Jeremiah, the end of Jeremiah, were borrowed from the book of Kings. These bits are borrowed from, but also kind of updated and changed from the book of Kings. They focus a little bit more on King Hezekiah, and there's a few differences and so on. But they're narrative that come from a different part of the Bible, so they've been edited there as an ending to the book in a way, just like the ending of the book of Jeremiah contains bits of the book of Kings. But then there's this big change starting with chapter 40, where after chapter 40 we don't hear the name Isaiah anymore. We also don't get narratives much anymore. That is, these stories about Isaiah. If you look at Isaiah chapter 7, the Emmanuel prophecy, there's this big long story that goes along with it. It wasn't written by Isaiah. Isaiah is a character in the story. Some later of Isaiah's disciples remembered his prophecies, and they wrote the story of what happened to help everyone understand why did Isaiah say these things. It's a bit of the context we're missing for someone like Amos, say, or Micah. So I'm grateful that his disciples wrote that stuff down. But then, starting with chapter 40 all the way through the end of the book, chapter 66, there's no more mention of the person Isaiah. There's no more stories about Isaiah. It changes pretty radically to all poetry, and the historical references seem to change. So if you look at chapter 45, which I'll mention later today, Cyrus, a particular king of the Persian Empire, is mentioned. And it's said to be the savior. Cyrus is said to be the savior of the people, used by God to be the instrument or the way that God is going to save the people. Cyrus is a very particular king who lived in a very particular time, and this wouldn't have made any sense to people in the year 700 BC. Literally would have made no sense to them. I've got a theological principle that is the core of my understanding of the Bible, which is that God speaks to people in ways they can understand. God doesn't speak over their heads. God's an incarnational God in that way. God speaks through culture that people understand, through languages people understand. God is trying to communicate with people. So telling people about Cyrus, something that's going to happen hundreds of years in the future, that doesn't fit with what I know of ancient prophecy, ancient prophets. That doesn't seem to be how they work or what they talk about. But also, it just wouldn't have done anything for anyone for quite a long time. So why would this be the centerpiece of the book of Isaiah? Instead, there are biblical scholars who have come up with other ways to understand how the book of Isaiah works. Instead of it all being written by Isaiah ben Amoz, which even it doesn't say it is, like I said, chapters 36 through 39 are all clearly taken from the book of Kings and updated. That wasn't Isaiah who wrote that. We've got other people writing parts of it, just like Baruch writes part of Jeremiah, and we know that the book is clear about it. It's not lying about it or worried about it in any way. People have noticed this for a long time, that Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 seem to refer to a different historical time period. We forget about kind of all the particular problems that existed in Judah around the year 700 BC. We stop hearing about Assyria. Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 talk a lot about Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, the people who lived in Mesopotamia who were dominant at the time, who were conquering nations and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, who conquered lands around Judah, and who almost destroyed Judah, destroyed all except for Jerusalem within Judah. That was King Sennacherib of the Assyrian Empire. That's the context for Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 talk about Babylon all the time. They don't talk about Assyria anymore. So it's referring to a different historical time period. People noticed this much earlier than kind of modern biblical scholars. So a medieval rabbi, a medieval Jewish biblical scholar, Abraham ibn Ezra, and philosopher and so on, a very, very famous rabbi, he noticed this and wrote about it and said, Isaiah 40 through 66 seems to refer to a different time period. It seems to change quite a bit. Maybe there's different authors. And modern biblical scholars picked up on this as well. So the first person to write about this in detail was Bernard Doom, a German scholar. You can see an image of there. And so Doom wrote a commentary in Isaiah where he says, okay, there's probably 3 different authors. And he starts to call them 1st and 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. So the person who wrote Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 probably wasn't named Isaiah, but they were a disciple of Isaiah's many centuries later. And we can tell that because Isaiah 40 through 55 is different. The poetry is different from Isaiah 1 through 39. We can tell it seems like a different author. If you kind of read one book and then read another book, you can sort of pick up on differences between 2 different authors. Hemingway doesn't sound like Jane Austen, right? They sound like different authors. You can pick up on that. But what's interesting is that Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 clearly draw from and pull from very particular images and theology of Isaiah ben Amoz, Isaiah of Jerusalem, that original prophet from the 8th century. So, in other words, Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, they weren't like randomly attached to this book. They draw from the theological well of Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. These are people who have imbibed all of this, and they are drawing images. For example, the highway, which we'll talk about in a little bit, comes up in Isaiah. The work of Isaiah ben Amoz. So Isaiah chapter 14 talks about a highway. And there's actually several times in Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 where we see this image of a highway. God's going to save people through a highway. Well, Isaiah chapter 40 is all about a highway. And it starts with that imagery. But also things like the phrase, the Holy One of Israel, which comes up again and again in Isaiah chapters 40 through 66. This clearly pulls from the words of Isaiah ben Amoz, the way that Isaiah ben Amoz talks about Yahweh. So, in any event, if we can say this, the book of Isaiah has 3 different parts that refer to 3 different historical contexts, and that have 3 different styles, but they're linked by very similar theologies. That is, the people who wrote Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, the 2 different chunks that make up Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, they were deeply informed by the theology of Isaiah ben Amoz, or First Isaiah. So First Isaiah is like a literary work that refers to and describes and explains, gives historical context for the work of Isaiah ben Amoz. And that's chapters 1 through 39. Remember, Isaiah doesn't write all of this. Other people write a whole bunch of it, but it does preserve some of the words of the historical prophet Isaiah ben Amoz. And the historical context is the city of Jerusalem right around the years 740 to 700 BC, and the 2 major crises that happened during that time period. That's the kind of core of what's going on in First Isaiah. Second Isaiah, we'd say, is chapters 40 through 55, and the historical context here is the Babylonian exile, which is why we're studying it in this class, prophets of the exile. But it's right at the end, so the exile ends. it's like, when does a crisis end? When is COVID over, right? Never really, right? I mean, it's always with us, and there's kind of different ways to measure ending. But one of the moments that really ends what we would call the time of the exile and begins what we might call the time of the diaspora, the scattering abroad of peoples. So not all Jews go home at the end of the exile. Many of them stay in perpetuity, like just for thousands of years, stay living in the Middle East instead of living in what now is Iraq. Until very recently, till the 20th century, there were a lot of Jews that lived in Baghdad. Obviously, that situation has changed now, but nonetheless, so from 540 BC, the people continued to live there. Jews continued to live there, which, were they still in the exile? Not really. They didn't have to be there. So in any event, all to say that the exile sort of ends in 539 BC, which is when King Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon and gives a decree that allows people to go home and gives them some funds to help support them going back home and rebuilding their cities, which the Babylonians had destroyed, and rebuilding their temples, which the Babylonians had destroyed. And then we have 3rd Isaiah. Again, 2nd Isaiah is like kind of spoken at the moment that people are about to go home. Now, why would 2nd Isaiah need to talk to people at that point in time? Everyone's happy, right? Well, no, not really. A lot of people are wondering. A lot of Jews who have been exiled to Babylon are wondering, do we go home? Should we go home? Should we build a temple to Yahweh again? Or should we take on the Persian gods? Or, what do we actually do now that we're going to rebuild? And 2nd Isaiah seems to have been incredibly important and influential in convincing people that what happened is that Yahweh is sending them home. The God of Israel is rebuilding the relationship with them. And there's a lot of questions that come to that. So what about Jerusalem? Is it still the important city? What about the temple? Is it still the important place? What about our relationship to God? Is it still a relationship of election? Are we still special to God? There's a lot of questions to answer. And 2nd Isaiah is this anonymous poet. I'm going to use 2nd Isaiah because it's kind of part of the book of Isaiah. But whoever this poet was, they didn't talk about themselves. They didn't write their own name. Maybe this person is hinted at in the figure of the suffering servant, but we'll get to that next time. So then 3rd Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, seem to refer to another different historical context, different even than 2nd Isaiah. It's from roughly the same time as 2nd Isaiah, but it seems to address a situation where the temple has been rebuilt, or it's in the process of being rebuilt, enough so that they're having conversations, discussions, arguments about who is allowed inside the temple. Are foreigners allowed inside the temple? Are people who we would call foreigners allowed inside the temple? We being the people who came back from exile. So are there Jews who live in the land who we don't know their pedigree, and so we being the people who have come back from exile, who control the temple now because we come back from money from exile, and we were the elite before, right? The people who were sent into exile were the royal family, other people who were important counselors, priests, high priests, important priestly families. They were sent into exile, right? They come back and they have money from the Persian king to rebuild the temple. So then there are all sorts of questions, right? Who's allowed in? Who controls the space? Are foreigners allowed in? What do we do with people who don't fit the categories that we expect? And those are all kinds of questions that are brought up then about how to be a community. And that's what 3rd Isaiah is written about. I'm going to mention 3rd Isaiah. I'm going to talk about it a little bit next time. We'll end with a little bit with 3rd Isaiah, so I don't want to just cut that part of the book off. But all to say, it's probably written sometime around the year 515 BC. Now, I should say there are scholars who argue with all of this stuff. This is just the way that I would present it, but I'm not a scholar of Isaiah primarily, so I defer to other scholars who would know more than me about a lot of these things. But there's not like one scholarly opinion. There's lots of scholarly opinions on this. So in any event, the time period we're saying, I would say sometime around 540 BC would be the time when 2nd Isaiah was written, because it doesn't seem like Babylon has fallen yet. It seems like that's a future event, but it seems like it's about to happen. Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 are spoken to a people who might not go home, right? So it's chapter 43, verse 14 of Isaiah. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. And there's words like Redeemer, Holy One. Those are important for the theology of Isaiah, and we'll get to in a minute. For your sake, I will send to Babylon and break down all the bars, and the shouting of the Chaldeans will be turned into lamentation. So it hasn't happened yet, right? God's about to break down the city of Babylon. And actually, that's an important one because I'm going to break down all the bars, and I'm going to send people home as if it hasn't happened yet. And then chapter 45 of Isaiah says, "Thus says the Lord to God's anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped. I will go forward before you to destroy all these nations," and so on. So Cyrus is being chosen by God to be the instrument of God's salvation to defeat the Babylonians, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, the thing is, how would anyone believe this, right? I mean, the Persian Empire was not terribly important it wasn't an empire for most of ancient Israel's history. So here's the situation sometime around, let's say, 540 BC. So here's Judah, right? Here's Judah, and here's the Dead Sea, here's the Jordan River, here's the Sea of Galilee, right? So this is all kind of Israel right here, Northern Kingdom, and then Judah down here. And the Northern Kingdom had been destroyed for a long time. Now we're getting the beginnings of what we might call the Samaritan community there. And then Judah is subject to the Babylonian Empire, as we know. It's been, it is destroyed. The city of Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. So from 587 to 539, there's just kind of a smoking heap of rubble there. And the rebuilding starts to happen after the Persian Empire comes. So in any event, here's this little area here, and it's part of this larger Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians never quite conquer Egypt. They want to, but they try, but they never quite conquer Egypt. But they occupy what we might call the Fertile Crescent up to the point of Egypt. So they're the most powerful kingdom in Mesopotamia, which is why they're able to control this whole region. You can see Assyria up here, which gets defeated by Babylon. So now they're a vassal of the Babylonians and so on. And so if you look at this, you say, well, the Babylonians are clearly super powerful. So how is it that they only had an empire that lasted a very short amount of time, less than 1 century, really? The Neo-Babylonian Empire, I say Neo-Babylonian because Hammurabi was a Babylonian king. He ran the Babylonian Empire, but that was way back in the year 1800 BC. So about 800 years before David's time, before the beginning of Israel as a kingdom. 800 years before that is when Hammurabi, king of Babylon, exists. And then Babylon is subdued for many, many centuries and then reasserts its power in around 625 BC. So this is the Neo-Babylonian, the New Babylonian Empire. So you might look at this and be like, Babylon is so powerful. How in the world did they fall so quickly? And especially so quickly to the Persians, who hadn't been important in the history of the Near East until that point. Well, there's another way to see that map. So here's that pretty much the same map. Here's Jerusalem over here, which was destroyed at the time. Here's the Babylonian Empire, right? Here's Babylon, and here's Nippur, where a lot of, where Ezekiel lived, right? A lot of Jews lived here and so on. And here is the Median Empire, which is around it and behind it and is much bigger. Now, in this previous map, take a look at the Medes. They look like just kind of one people among many. The Medes live here, the Urartu people live here, the Hittites live here, the Egyptians live here. But, I mean, take a look at this map again. Look at that Median Empire. Okay, so the Medes are people who rise to dominance in the area to the north and east of Babylon, which includes the Iranian Plateau, the area of Armenia, and into what we would call here Anatolia or Asia Minor, Turkey, basically. Eastern Turkey is kind of what they hold, and then they go all the way into northern India. And into Bactria, what's today like Tibet. So the Median Empire is huge. And the Persians live down here, and they are like cousins of the Medes. The Medes have not been terribly important in the history of the world up to this point in the history of the Near East. They have not been as powerful as the kingdoms that exist in Mesopotamia, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They have a pretty sharp rise to power, and the Persians have an even sharper rise to power. They're pretty much a nomadic horse people until just a couple of generations before they become conquerors of what to them seems like the whole world. They become the largest kingdom that had ever existed in the history of the earth that we know of up to that point. And again, this is like a 40-year transformation. They kind of co-opt the Median Empire and then lead the destruction of Babylon. Babylon's been weakening for a long time at this point. They have a very weak king who seems to kind of live in the wilderness for decades and weakens their power significantly. And basically when the Persians come knocking, the Persians take over the Median they don't like fight a war exactly, but the Persians kind of co-opt the Median Empire, and King Cyrus ends up taking over. And at the time of King Cyrus, right around the year 540 BC, this is now the Persian Empire. You can see it's taken over all of Asia Minor, or what we call today Turkey. You can see that the Armenia area, the Bactrian area, all of what was the Median Empire up at that point, the Iranian plateau. And so they're much larger than Babylon in 540 BC. So in other words, let's say you're a Jewish prophet and you're living here in Babylon around 540 BC. It wouldn't have taken a genius to figure out that Persia was knocking on the door of Babylon. Also, the priests who lived in Babylon hated the last of the Babylonian kings and were openly pleading with the King Cyrus of the Persian Empire to come and take Babylon. They said, we'll open the doors to you. And in fact, that's what happened. When the Persian king comes, when Cyrus comes with his army to Babylon, the residents of Babylon open up the doors and welcome in the Persian king without a fight. Babylon gives up without a fight. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out that Persia is knocking on the door, and it's possible that the Persian king Cyrus had already said to people in Babylon, hey, I'm going to send you home, if you support me, and so on. So it's not that the prophecy of Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 is out of the blue. It's not revelatory in that sense. Like, someone paying attention to global affairs would have been able to figure out that Persia was, at least without a miracle, Persia was going to take over the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But what's amazing about the prophecy of Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 is not so much that it's telling the future. What's amazing is that it gives a new way, a convincing new way, for Jews who had lived through the time of the exile and who were about to give up on their faith. And it offers an entirely new understanding of Yahweh, of Judaism, we might begin to call it at this point in time, of how God works in the world, that is deeply informative for the theology of Jews and Christians. We won't exist without Isaiah 40 through 55. So what Isaiah 40 through 55 offers is a new way of understanding God, more so than like special insight into global politics and like the future. So that's there are some core ideas here, including a theology of the word, which I think is hugely important for transforming ancient Judaism from a religion of sacrifice in the temple into a religion of the text. And without Isaiah's theology of the word of God, and thinking anew about prophecy. So thinking about prophecy less in terms of, we don't even know who Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 was written by. The personality of the prophets becomes much less important, and continuing the interpretation of the word, the written word, which remember Isaiah says, write down, in Isaiah chapter 8, write down this stuff and pass it on to my disciples. Well, Isaiah 40 through 55 clearly has read, studied, imbued, soaked in the written words of Isaiah, and now is reinterpreting them for a new day. And my God, this is what we like. This is what Christians and Jews do today. We read the word, and we think about it in terms of our new contexts that we're living into. So Isaiah 40-55 is the beginning of this transformation in a way. I've pointed to this also with Jeremiah chapter 36 and Baruch, the scribe. So in any event, this is a part of that transformation, but this is a really important one, a crucial one. So there's a lot of other things that we'll talk about, but that's one of the crucial bits. So here's a little image of Cyrus the Great, this Persian king who defeats the Babylonian armies, conquers the city of Babylon, and has this brilliant idea to send everyone home. The Babylonians had tried to rule people by threat and by power, just like the Assyrians did, rule people with violence, and it's useful up to a point. It creates a system where people hate you, but they'll work for you because they're scared. They're scared to do anything else. scared to rebel against you. That's why Jerusalem gets destroyed, because it rebels, and the Babylonian Empire wants to make an example of them. Well, the Persians are very different, and Cyrus adopts a very different mode of propaganda, we might say, relating to people and he says, it's hard to fight against all these people that I have conquered. I'll fight against them if I need to, but I'd rather they work for me and with me voluntarily. I'd rather they love to be a part of my empire. So what he does is he comes up with a new idea, and that is, I want to make my empire fun. Not fun, really. I mean, that's a joke. But I want to make my empire, I want to make people want to be part of my empire. I want to treat them nicely in a way. He can be cruel to people too. But the first step is to try to be really nice to them. And nice to them in the sense, I'm going to send all the exiles home, and I make a big deal about it, right? It's for the propaganda value, right? I'm going to send them all home. I'm going to give them money to restore their temples. I'm going to tell them that their temples and their culture, their history are important. The Persians begin to create art that depicts people. The Persepolis reliefs, the Apadana was a building in Persepolis, like a hall that the kings would welcome foreign dignitaries to. So this Apadana hall existed in a place called Persepolis, which is one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, where the kings lived for part of the year. On the walls of this, they depicted 70 different nations. They depicted people with physiognomy that would have looked fairly, it would have resembled the people from that area. The people would have been wearing the clothes that looked like clothes from their area. They were carrying, on these are carvings, right? And the people were carrying kind of items that local people would have actually created. So, the Persians were trying to show all the peoples of the empire gladly and joyfully bringing all of their gifts to the Persian king, because it was so great to be part of the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire was rapacious. It was trying to get as much as it possibly could. It was trying, it existed to benefit the kings of Persia, just like all empires exist in that way. So this was but it worked, right? It was propaganda, but it worked. At least it worked for a while, and it worked a lot better than the Babylonian propaganda, because the parts of the Persian Empire cohered for quite some time, until the time of Alexander the Great, some centuries later, right? So around the year 332 is when the Persian Empire begins to really fall. So you have a couple centuries of pretty strong Persian rule over a large territory, the largest territory that anyone had ever ruled that we know of in the history of the world, ruling over all these different peoples. So this was effective propaganda. But also you'll find that in the Bible, Persia is looked at pretty positively, because the Persian king freed the people, sent them home, and they didn't all have to go home. Starting in 539, they could go home. A lot of people stayed for a long time, centuries even, or some people stayed indeterminately, right, for millennia. In Babylon. So people didn't have to go home, but they were encouraged to go home, and they were given money to go home to rebuild their temples. And this was hugely important for the Bible. The people who wrote the Bible saw this in a positive light. So you won't find a lot of bad-mouthing of the Persian Empire in the Bible, like you'll find bad-mouthing of Babylon. Babylon, remember, gets good positive and negative reviews, right? Jeremiah says, God gave us Babylon. We have to submit to them. And they're terrible, but the Persian Empire seems different in the Bible, even if it was a fairly rapacious theology, and the Persian Empire was designed to support the Persian king, and they took probably more than the Babylonians did in raw terms, but. All to say, just the fact that Jerusalem was rebuilt preserved the possibility of the Jewish people, in perpetuity. So. Without that, it's possible that Judaism would have failed to, wouldn't have existed. I mean, again, we're talking about, is God going to let the Jewish people fade out? My belief is no, never. But ultimately, it's hard to see how, kind of thinking in terms of real politics and stuff, it's difficult to see how this would have existed without a rejuvenation of Jerusalem. Okay, so let's think about this then. 2 Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 are fairly unified by this being spoken to and written to a particular people. again, we don't know who's writing this. It's an anonymous voice, but someone who's soaked in the theology of Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. This person has got a message. That message is, don't give up hope. God has not forgotten us. God will not forget us. And the time has changed. This is a new day. A new thing is happening. We have a new moment. So chapter 43 of Isaiah, verse 18, do not remember the former things or consider things of old. This is like hyperbole, like Isaiah talks about. Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 talk about the old things, the things that formerly happened. It talks about them a lot. So this is exaggeration, right? But don't even think about those old things, because I'm about to do a new thing, God says. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. So a couple things here. One is God is about to do a new thing. It hasn't happened yet, but God's about to do it. And it's going to involve two things. Making a way in the wilderness. So again, this wilderness theology, right? Think about Isaiah, and I was thinking about Ezekiel, right? The being in the wilderness, and God is able to move into the wilderness and be with the people. Well, God's going to make a way in the wilderness, a path through the wilderness. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But this path going through a place that seems inhospitable, and God is able to provide for the people, but also send them back home through the wilderness. This evokes ideas about the Exodus, right? The wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, where God provides for the people and sends them back to a new place, right? Gives them a land. This is the whole point of the Exodus, is that they're delivered so that they can be given a land. Which is the land of Israel, right? The promised land. Well, the way in the wilderness reminds them that you're going to go back to this land. It's re-promising the land. And then rivers in the desert. So a place that can't sustain life, God is going to provide the foundation for life there. And this has to do with creation. So creation theology is hugely important for 2nd Isaiah. As it is for 1st Isaiah, God's ability to do these new things and provide for life in spaces that are inhospitable, but also that God is dedicated to rebuilding this people, and it's going to take a new exodus to do it. So God's going to kind of reimagine these old ways of doing things, the old covenants. We'll talk about that more next time, and the old city, Jerusalem, and God is going to renew all of that. It's going to be the old things in a new way. So it's funny, like, don't remember, Isaiah 43. Don't remember those old ways. Don't remember those old things. But then you got this mention of the Exodus, right? Rivers, like the Red Sea, and all to say, it's kind of a funny juxtaposition. Okay, so let's start though. Isaiah chapter 40. You can see this kind of what's called the yawning gap. So Isaiah chapters 36 through 39 take place in the year 701 BC. And at the very end of this part of Isaiah, King Hezekiah survives an attack from the Assyrian Empire. And Isaiah says Jerusalem's going to survive. But then chapter 39 comes, and at that time, King Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan of Babylon, sends envoys. And this is before Babylon was a kingdom, really. This guy's calling himself king, but he's an upstart, and he's a rebel. Babylon at this time, in the year 701 BC, is a part of the Assyrian Empire. So this is a guy who's trying to become the Babylonian king. He's trying to curry favor with other people to rebel against Assyria at the same time as him, right? So he sends envoys to King Hezekiah. And he's like, hey, rebel against Assyria with me, buddy. Let's join forces. And he's trying to get all the kings in this region to join forces and to throw off the oppressive Assyrian kingdom. And Hezekiah listens to this guy and then kind of gives him some treasure and things, right? I mean, and Isaiah says, oh, that was bad, right? Isaiah's big message is, don't submit to foreign kings. Yahweh alone. Believe in Yahweh alone. Yahweh's enough for us. So verse 5, Isaiah says to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days are coming when all that's in your house and all that your ancestors have stored up to this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your own sons will be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. This will become important next time, for next week. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. I mean, in other words, like, it's right, it's true. You said truth. But then he thought, kind of in his mind, yeah, well, there'll be peace and security in my days. My kids are going to have some big problems with Babylon, but I'm not going to, so great. So Hezekiah is shown in a not positive light here, a negative light, that he's thinking about himself only and his own security. But just notice that the mention of Babylon here ends what's called 1st Isaiah. Like it's a meditation, really, on the end of the kingdom of Judah when Babylon is going to destroy. But it's like seen as a thing distant in the future, right? Isaiah is talking about. And then chapter 40, we get this gulf. Chapter 40 says, comfort, oh, comfort my people. It's the people are about to be sent home and comforted. So we miss the exile. Isaiah Ben Amos of Jerusalem is talking about how someday there's going to be an exile, and then all of a sudden we're about to be sent home from the exile. So if you want to know about the exile itself, you can learn a little bit of it from 2nd Isaiah. But really you got to look to Jeremiah and Ezekiel first to fill in the details. That's why we did Jeremiah and then Ezekiel and then 2nd Isaiah, because 2nd Isaiah comes at the very, the people are hearing the words of comfort after a long time of not being comforted. Now, another thing here that's really important is that this comfort, oh comfort, and that God is kind of seeing and noticing and sending comfort to the people in exile. This is a reference to another prophetic book, a book of Lamentations, which is really a poetic book. It's often understood that Jeremiah says this. But if you turn to Lamentations, which is in the Christian Bible just after the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is understood to be the author of Lamentations in tradition, but there's no evidence in the book of Lamentations that he is. So in any event, but if you look to Lamentations chapter 1, it's all about how Judah has gone into exile, Jerusalem was destroyed, and if you look at like verse 7, her people fell into the hand of the foe. There was no one to help her. No one to help her. No one is noticing, and so on. And there's a refrain here that it's really Lamentations is about the pain, the felt pain of the destruction of Jerusalem. And the people are groaning and they're sad. I'm going to get to this more next time, but notice that the city is personified as a person, like verse 6, daughter Zion. So daughter Zion is a personification of the city, and she is crying, she is groaning, she has suffered so much, and this is like a tension. God has judged Jerusalem. Is God ever going to take us back? And that's how the book of Lamentations ends in chapter 5. Would God ever take us back? So Lamentations 5:21, restore to us, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days of old, unless you've utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. That's it. Maybe you're done with us. Maybe not. So Lamentations chapter 3, verse 37. This is another expression of the problem that people felt at this time who were in exile or who were living in Judah during the exile. Who can command and have it done if the Lord has not ordained it? In other words, God did this. God did this. Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should any who draw breath complain about the punishment of their sins? That's a real tension, but Lamentations is all about complaining about the sins, or about kind of complaining about the punishment for sins, right? It's not saying shut up about it, but it's saying, it's naming a tension, a problem. If God has judged us, is there hope for us? Is there a future for us? Will God listen to us that we want things to change? There's another refrain here that happens again and again. If you go back to chapter 1 of Lamentations, and that's verse 16, let's say, is an example of this. For these things I weep, my eye flows with tears, for a comforter is far from me. Or look at verse 21 of chapter 1. They heard how I was groaning with no one to comfort me. No one to comfort. No one sees me. No one notices me. No one comforts me. There is no one to comfort, no one to help, no one to listen. Verse 9 is another one of these. Her downfall was appalling, with no one to comfort her. And then Zion says, "O Lord, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed." Getting God to notice and comfort. Or verse 2, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. So it's a refrain in the book of Lamentations. There is no one to comfort. There is no one to comfort. There is no one to comfort. God has abandoned us. So then go back to Isaiah chapter 40 and notice, comfort. "O comfort my people, says your God." Now, if you notice in other translations like the King James, comfort ye, we don't say the word ye anymore, but ye is like a plural, right? Comfort, "O comfort my people," sounds like an individual thing maybe. but it's a command that's in the Hebrew. It's a command that's given to multiple people, a bunch of people. So there's a bunch of assembled people who are hearing God say, "Comfort, oh comfort my people." And then we have a narrator that says you're God. So we, the people, are hearing a report from someone that God has said to a number of beings, "Give comfort to my people." It's a command that God has started to give. And then speak tenderly to Jerusalem. God is commanding all these assembled people, prophets, divine beings, angels. We don't know. It's not really clear. It's not spelled out. But God is commanding a bunch of beings to give comfort and to speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her, proclaim to her that she has served her term, her penalty is paid, she has received from Yahweh's hand double for all her sins. The bad times are done, right? She served her term. That's a word of like it's almost like when you get conscripted in the military in the ancient world, that's the word for that service, like hard servitude, almost indentured servitude sometimes, or army service that is demanded of you. It's done. Like all that hard service is done. The penalty is paid. The paying of sin. This is a new metaphor that begins to emerge during the time of the exile, which is that sin is a debt that needs to be paid. Before the time of the exile, sin seems to be this kind of like evil force that attaches to the altar in the temple. During the time of the exile, there's no altar to attach sins to. So what is sin? How does it work? There's a new metaphor that develops during the time of the exile, which is debt. So if you can't get rid of your sins by sacrificing and cleaning the altar, how are you going to get rid of your sins? Well, you can pray for God to forgive your debt, which is something that happened in the ancient world sometimes. If you got really in debt, it was possible for someone who had more authority than you, a local leader, a king, to forgive debts. And then, so this is borrowing from the culture around them. How do you understand sin if your way of understanding sin and dealing with it has been totally destroyed? So this is a new metaphor. So she's, there was a debt that has been paid, and that she's received from the Lord's hand double. Like the debt was double. What? God doubled the debt? That doesn't make sense, right? No. This is an admission here from Isaiah, and there's several times in Isaiah 40 through 55 where there's this like seeming admission. I went too far. I did too much. Now that sounds scandalous to many Christians and Jews today, right? I mean, like, God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't make errors. But just imagine the message to a people who are upset about God's abandonment. The message of, hey, I might have gone too far. You've received double for all of these sins. There's another mention that I'll get to next time, where God says, "Yeah, I might have actually abandoned you. I did abandon you for a moment, but that time is done." This reminds me of Jesus' cry of dereliction from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? So all to say, this message is being spoken, and then a voice cries out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain," you're probably hearing this sung, right, like the Messiah, right? "Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill made low, the uneven ground shall become level, the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together. The mouth of the Lord has spoken." That's the message, right? So a voice, is it God? I don't know. Is this is this the voice of comfort? Right? God tells a bunch of, my guess is here that this is the divine council. This is all the angels. God speaking to the angels and says, "Hey, give comfort to my people." And tell them that they've, and sometimes the prophets get to hang out and hear this stuff that happens in what's called the divine council, God's meetings with the angels. So 1 Kings 22, the story of Micaiah ben Imlah, this prophet who's able to be in the court, or Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah is in the temple and there's like, holy, 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 and all that stuff. That's the divine council. That's God's meeting with the angels. The angels are flying around and covering themselves from God's glory. So all to say that this might be a divine council scene, or God is meeting with the angels, and the prophet is allowed to come because the prophet is a messenger of God too. just like the angels are the messengers of God. So the prophets are kind of gathered around, and the divine beings are gathered around God's throne, and God says, okay, it's time. I'm switching. Boom. I'm going to go from the exile to the time beyond, right? We're going to deliver the people. And this is how the gospel happens. The good news happens, comes out of nowhere, and it's unexpected. The timing is unexpected. The shift from lament to praise is momentarily, right? It comes out of nowhere sometimes. So a voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. In the New Testament, this is understood to be reference to John the Baptist. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. A voice cries out in the wilderness is how it's understood, right? That is the phrase. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. But because of the way Hebrew poetry works, we know that, at least for the time of 2nd Isaiah, at the time this was written, it would have meant a voice cries out. This is one of the voices gathered around the divine council. A voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So it's the way, the highway, build a highway in the wilderness and lift up those valleys. Why are you lifting up valleys and making mountains low? Because you're making a graded, think about like making train tracks or something. They have to be like no more than a 3% grade, right? Or the train will fall over. So in the ancient world too, you wanted to make highways or roads that you could use to transport goods from one place to another. And people going back from exile are going to have to transport a lot of stuff. So you have to make these nice roads, which are really rare in the ancient world. A highway or a king's highway, right? They would have been protected by soldiers. They would have had to pay money to use them like a way, toll. But the whole point is to try to help facilitate the movement of people and goods throughout a kingdom. So build one of these awesome roads that's like built, leveled up, and the mountains are leveled down and the valleys are lifted up so that it's flat, so you can run a cart all along the way, which these were, again, really rare and difficult to make. So make one of these awesome highways through the desert, through the wilderness. Now that would have been unbelievable, right? A highway through the wilderness. Here's an ancient Roman highway, by the way. These are really hard to make, and through the wilderness. So let's refresh our geography here. Okay, so here's a map of Babylon, right about the time of 2nd Isaiah, and notice we got Babylon here, and these are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that are creating a space that is habitable, livable, right? You can farm there, so you can live there. And then you can see the Fertile Crescent kind of like skips the wilderness area. So if you're going to go directly from Babylon to Jerusalem, you're going to go through this area that the Babylonian Empire doesn't own. Did they not own this area? It's kind of colored in white here, not purple, to say that they didn't own it. Did they not own that because they weren't strong enough to defeat all of the large nations that lived here? No, it's because it's desert. It's literally desert. Nomadic people traverse it every once in a while, but it is very difficult to live in, and the Babylonians don't want to own that space. If you went from Babylon to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem to Babylon, you would have moved up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and then down the seacoast, because those were the only habitable places. There was a road, a King's Highway, that went up the seacoast, and then you would go down major highways into Babylon that were controlled by either the Babylonian or Assyrian kings, depending on who was dominant at that time, and then later the Persians. But so what Isaiah chapter 40 is saying is, in this wilderness between Babylon and Jerusalem, in the nothing, nowhere space that's there, right? We're going to build a highway. Now, why would you build a highway from Jerusalem to Babylon through the wilderness? Well, and remember, there's no gas stations back then. There's no convenience stations in the middle of deserts. I mean, you die out there. There's no water. Why would you build a highway like this? Because it's the quickest way to get home. We're going to get home so quick, it's going to blow your mind. And we're going to be able to move through spaces that you wouldn't even imagine could support life. Like Jerusalem itself, which is a burned out rubble of a city. And there's how are we going to survive? Don't worry, God's going to make a way. And God's going to do this work. God's going to make this highway flattened out and for you. And God's going to, this is metaphorical too, right? All these rough places God's going to make smooth for you so that you can go home. Now remember, a lot of Jews in Babylon had made a pretty good life of it. They had food, and they had houses, they had gardens, they had jobs. They had responsibilities, they had businesses. Honestly, we have records of some of these businesses the Jews had at the time in Babylon. So to go home, you had to give up a lot. And you were moving back to a place that was broken and destroyed. So you were giving up everything and maybe getting nothing in return. But Isaiah 40 is trying to tell us God will provide a way, and God is going to remove the obstacles in your way in order to make it so that you can go home. And the point of all of this is that the glory of the Lord, verse 5, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh, all peoples, all living beings shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This is the word of the Lord. God has said that this is going to happen. And God's glory will be revealed. This harkens back to Exodus. The whole reason the Exodus happens, according to the book of Exodus, is so that the nations may know my glory. And so the glory of the Lord is going to be revealed, and all people are going to see it. God is doing this not just to help some random people. God is doing this in order to show the divine glory, and this is more reason why God would do it, right? But the revelation of that God is able to do this amazing thing. And we can say that the persistence of the Jewish people throughout history, with over and against constant attempts to destroy them and eradicate them, this is a testament to God's faithfulness. So all to say, currently, there's a huge dispute in the state of Israel and the territories of Palestine, especially the Gaza Strip. Sometimes this can be, this theology of chosenness can be abused. That is to say, I believe in the right for the state of Israel to exist. The UN ratified it in 1947, and there's nothing I can do about that now. I think that it was handled in a way that was people in positions of power didn't think through all of the ramifications of what they're doing, and didn't provide for the Palestinian people that were going to be displaced. There's a lot of moral problems on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide. Rockets being shot by Hamas into the state of Israel are not acceptable and morally problematic. But at the same time, seeing Palestinian people be evicted, moved out of territories that are Palestinian for no purpose, being cut off from water supplies, the bombing of Gaza, which I know that Israel thinks it's taking care of. The state of Israel, the modern nation state of Israel, is taking care of in destroying terrorist facilities. Also, there are schools and families and so on that are being destroyed. All to say that this is a morally complex situation. Just to say the theology of election can be abused by Christians as well, who have abused this and have used it to abuse Jews over a long period of time. Nonetheless, all throughout all of this mess, the moral mess and the complicated mess of Christians treating Jews poorly over the centuries, the persistence of the Jewish people through persecution, I do think, is a testament to God's promises. So in any event, the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This is the word of God theology in chapter 5, that all people are going to see this, and God has said it, it's going to happen. And that word of the word of God continues in verse 6. A voice says, cry out. Now, a voice said cried out in verse 3, right? So a voice is saying, hey, everyone, say this stuff, say the comforting stuff. Tell the people that the comfort is about to emerge. And I say, what shall I cry? Now, is this the voice of the prophet? So the prophet's like, what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to tell the people? And then it seems like the prophet kind of gets introspective for a moment and says, what am I going to say? How am I going to give comfort? The people are withering. They're withering on the vine. They don't have faith anymore. They've been in Babylon for generations now, and they don't really believe anymore. And we hear this again in verse 27 of chapter 40, this the words of the people being spoken back by the prophet to God. And then God is kind of repeating them. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? My right meaning like what's right for me, or like my case. God doesn't care about me. God isn't helping me. God isn't trying to do what's right for me. My way is hidden from the Lord. My way meaning like my life. Like God, what is happening to me is hidden from God. Yahweh can't see what's happening to me. And even if Yahweh knew what was happening to me, Yahweh wouldn't care, wouldn't do anything about it. Now, you've been in exile for generations. Maybe you think that. But Isaiah, the second Isaiah is designed to try to speak to people who are hardened and calloused and feel like God doesn't care. And in order to do this, in order to give this message, the Isaiah 40 through 55 uses poetry, brilliant poetry, beautiful poetry, but creates this amazing breadth of new images, new imagery in order to communicate this amazing word to the people. In light of time, I'm going to stop here. I know I haven't even gotten that far into Isaiah. We're at verse 6. However, next week, I've set all the groundwork. So next week, we are just going to move through chapters 40 through 55, and I will explain some things. For example, what happens to the Davidic covenant? God promised that Jerusalem and the Davidic king will sit on the throne forever. 2 Samuel 7 says this. But Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Davidic king, the line ended. So what happened? Well, Isaiah's got an answer to that. Also, the question, are there other gods out there? If so, do we have to fight against them? Do we have to worry about them? Are they trying to get us? Did Yahweh lose? Was Yahweh weaker than other gods? Is that why Jerusalem fell? Isaiah's got an answer to that question too. Lastly, what is this new thing that God is about to do? And what are we supposed to do in response? That's another major question that Isaiah brings up. But today, let me just leave us with this image of the highway, that God can make something happen that is unimaginable and that blows us away like a word coming out of thin air. It was not predetermined that the Jewish people were going to return home when King Cyrus gave them money and a bit of power, and that they were going to make it. The Moabites didn't make it. The Edomites didn't make it. The Phoenicians didn't make it in the sense of keeping their city-state together, for forever. But the Jews did. So how did that all happen? Well, Isaiah played a key part in that, and that's what we're going to get to next week.